As soon as we get the recording going, then we will get started. Good morning, Jan. Good morning, Crystal. Let's get it cracking. As
Good morning.
promised, good morning. As promised, we are going to get into contingencies today. Let me share my screen. Do a few things here. Hold on a minute. There we go. I did have this set up better, but thanks for your patience. Things don't always work out the way we choose. All right, contingencies. Let's hide the presenter view and get into it. So today we're going to cover this section of the contract that deals with contingencies. We are still in the grid, which is the upfront part of the contract that goes over all of the negotiable terms in the RPA. All right, my heater's off. I'm ready to roll. So let's jump into it. So before we get into contingencies, I like to talk about time periods and just kind of lay out how the time periods work. Day 0 is the day of acceptance. So whenever we're counting days, do remember that all of the days that are referred to in the residential purchase agreement are calendar days, with the exception of the time that you have to get the deposit into escrow. Those are the only business days that we count in the RPA. Everything else is going to be calendar days. The day that something happens is considered day 0, and we're always dealing with days after, right? So the next day after your offer gets accepted is going to be day 1. So you get that call, your offer's been accepted, you dance in your chair, you call your clients, you call your lender, you set up all of your inspections, you get everything rolling as soon as possible, right? Because we are usually dealing with a short time frame to get things done. So I usually say between 1 and 5 days, you want to make sure you're having all your inspections done, your pest, your home inspection, your roof inspection. That doesn't always work out exactly that way, but for the most part, that should be your goal. Now, remember, whenever you're doing like your home inspection, you're going to want your clients to be there at the end of the home inspection. So I always like to set up the home inspection. For example, starts at 10, goes from 10 to 12. I'm going to invite my clients to show up around 11:30, 11:45, because once the inspector is done with the inspection, then I'm going to have him walk my clients through that home and point out to them all of the action items. And I'm going to have that inspector firsthand, from his mouth to their ears, explain everything that he's going to put on that report that they're going to receive later. And I definitely want that to happen, because I don't want to find myself telling my clients, oh, that's important, that's not important. I want that to come directly from the inspector. It's also a great time for them to get another look at the house, do their measurements, all the things that they want to do, because oftentimes they've only seen the property one other time prior to making that offer. I don't want them to show up at the beginning of the inspection and follow the inspector around, right? I want him to have free access to do what he needs to do. And then at the end, like I said, walk the client through. All right, all that being said, sometime within that first 7 days, the seller is going to have to provide all of the disclosures, anything that they were contractually obligated to provide to the buyer. That all needs to come in within that 7-day frame. So by the end of day 7, I've got all my inspections and reports in hand. I've got all of my disclosures and deliverables in hand. And now I'm going to begin reviewing and determining if I want to move forward, and if I have any reason to ask for repairs or concessions or concessions. Did I say that twice? Okay, so that's what I'm going to be doing between day 7 and 17, once I have all my information. Come day 17, if I've left all of my dates the same as they are in the contract, then it's time for me to remove contingencies or cancel, right? And I've said this before, the sellers got their property off the market, allowing the buyer to have basically an exclusive opportunity to determine if this is the right home for them. During this time, the seller can't take another offer. They can't do anything with their home. They basically just have to allow that buyer to make a determination if they want to buy that house and under what conditions. So the buyer has an obligation to make a decision within 17 days and get those contingencies removed. Now, contractually, you will hear later on that it has to be in writing, that just because it's the 17th day does not mean that investigation contingency is already removed. It has to be done. So if you're representing a seller, it is really important that you're on top of these dates and you're on top of that buyer and that buyer's agent to make sure that's happening. And you're not compromising your seller by having them stay in the property when that buyer's not performing. So adhering to the dates is really important on both sides. Once those investigation contingencies are removed, we get the appraisal in and we have that contingency removed and we have the loan contingency removed. Then there's usually a few days for the lender to kind of pull everything together. The docs are drawn, delivered to escrow. The buyer signs those documents. There's maybe some back and forth. And then the recording happens, and it's the day of the recording, after the recording at the county recorder's office, that you're actually allowed to give the keys to the buyer, and the buyer can take possession unless there's something else in writing. Perhaps the seller's going to stay longer in the property or rent the property or something like that. But it's not until the day of recording that the buyer has the ability to take possession of the property. All right, let's get into the actual RPA and see what it says. So the first thing that we're going to start with is our loan contingency. But as you can see in the grid, they've made all of the dates 17 days. There used to be in the old contract 10 days, 5 days, 8 days. Just to keep everything the same, all of the contingency timeframes are now 17 days. Obviously, you can change those days up by putting something else in the box. If you don't think your loan contingency can be removed in 17 days, you can push it out and say, hey, it's going to take us 21 days or 25 days. Appraisal, you can lengthen or shorten the time frame. Investigation of property, any of these can be shortened or lengthened depending on what your client needs and what you think you can get away with and what you think will make your offer more attractive. Also, right here on the grid, you have the ability to remove 2 of the contingencies. Only 2 can be removed in the RPA, and that's the loan contingency and the appraisal contingency. For any of the other contingencies, you're going to have to attach a contingency removal form to remove any of the other contingencies. And then this review of the seller's documents is something that I definitely want to point out to you, because this is kind of a big thing that could come back and bite you. So the seller, as I mentioned, has the obligation to provide their disclosures, specifically what we call the statutory disclosures, which are required by contract. So that's your TDS, your SPQ, could be your ESD, maybe your lead. They have to give those documents to you, and you have 5 days after you've received those documents to cancel, regardless of whether you remove contingencies or not. And I'll get into that with you. The only time that that does not apply is if you have received, you the buyer have received all of those statutory required documents prior to writing the offer, and you've assigned them and sent them in with your offer. Otherwise, regardless of what numbers you put on here, you'll always have 5 days after you receive those documents to cancel. So that's a little kind of gotcha built into the contract that I want you to be aware of. So when we dig in, the first thing that we're going to deal with under contingencies is the loan contingency. And as I mentioned, it defaults to 17 days. Not shown here, you could just remove the contingency right from the grid. What does the contract say about the loan contingency? So a few things that I want to bring to your attention. The first thing that it outlines, and we discussed this in our meeting last week, is that failure for the property to appraise does not entitle the buyer to exercise cancellation based on the loan contingency. So oftentimes people will say, well, I'm going to remove my appraisal contingency and I'm not too worried about it because if the property doesn't appraise, I can't get my loan. And if I can't get my loan, then, I use my loan contingency. So they'll try to squeeze in using the appraisal contingency for the loan contingency. Well, they're on to us, and they've made it very clear in the contract that those two things are completely separate, and you cannot use your appraisal contingency to exercise your loan contingency, all right? If they are otherwise qualified for that loan program. The other thing that it says is there are certain other things that go into getting a loan, like making sure you have insurance. And so that, again, is not something that you can use to exercise your loan contingency. You investigating whether or not the property is insurable is a separate thing that you need to do and is not a contingency and does not fall under the loan contingency. Whether or not you have the money for your down payment and closing cost are also not contingencies, and you cannot use those to exercise your loan contingency. So removal of the appraisal contingency, again, is not deemed to be removal of the loan contingency. So they are completely separate. You can't say, I removed my appraisal, that means I removed my loan, and you can't say, hey, I didn't get my appraisal, therefore I'm using my loan contingency. If there is no loan contingency, then you are stating that obtaining a loan is not a contingency of the agreement. So if you come out and say, hey, I'm going to buy this all cash, and then you decide later on to try to get a loan, it's too late. You still have to be able to purchase the property all cash. Once you say no loan contingency, that means you cannot back out if you need a loan and you cannot get one. The next thing is the appraisal contingency. And again, as I showed you guys before, you can remove the appraisal contingency right in the grid. Sorry, not shown here. The appraisal contingency, though, they did a really interesting thing here because not only can you specify whether or not the property has to appraise, you can say for how much the property has to appraise. So sometimes when the market is extremely hot, a buyer is willing to make up the difference between the appraisal and the purchase price. So they might say, you know what, as long as it comes in at least 10,000 within the purchase price, I'll bring in the difference. I have no problem with that. Well, if that is the case, then you would want to check this box and then you'd want to write in whatever that amount is that you're comfortable with. So for simple math, I think I have it on my next slide, let's check. I have next. Okay, here we go. So for simple math, if my purchase price is $1 million and I'm willing to bring in 50 to make up the difference, then I'm saying as long as this property appraises for, my numbers look wrong, it's supposed to be 950, right? 995, whatever. My math is terrible. I can see right here that these numbers are wrong. Then that's the number that I would put in there, not 9,550,000, it's 900,050 that should go in that box, and I'll clean these slides up. But let's do another, let's get out of there because that's just going to confuse everybody. So let's just, for simple math, let's say the purchase price is 100,000 and I'm willing to bring in 10,000, then I would say as long as the property appraises for 90,000, then I'm okay. And that's enough to use your appraisal gap right there. You don't have to write another addendum. You don't have to use a bunch of paperwork. You're basically just saying, as long as it appraises for this amount, we're still good, and I cannot use my appraisal contingency if it hits at least that amount. And then you have your number of days there that to get the appraisal back in your hand to be able to remove the contingency. The other thing that's really big that came out in the new purchase agreement is when you speak to the appraisal, the only thing you're talking about is the value. So an appraisal does a lot more for us than just tell us what the property is worth. It also will measure the property. It will tell us about the condition of the property and several other things. So when you are removing your appraisal contingency, or when you're limiting it to a certain value, that does not take into consideration the fact that maybe it shows it's not as big as you thought it was. The square footage is off, or perhaps the lender is going to say, you know what, some repairs need to be made in order for us to lend on this. All of those items need to go under the inspection contingency. So anything that comes back on your appraisal about the condition of the property, that needs to be addressed in your investigation of the property contingency or your inspection contingency. And that makes it a little tricky, right? Because a lot of times if we go back, right, I'm going to skip back a little bit. If we go back in here, sometimes we'll have 17 days for the appraisal, but we will have shortened the investigation of the property contingency to something like 10 days. Well, what happens then if you find out, oh no, I've already removed my investigation of the property contingency, but I got something back on my appraisal that says there's an issue? Well, you're in trouble. And that's kind of why they made all of the days 17, to address those types of issues, right? With timing. So you're free to manipulate these different dates to make your offer more attractive, but do keep in mind that anything that comes up on your appraisal has to be addressed with the investigation of property contingency. And once that contingency is removed, you technically don't have the ability to go back and negotiate for those issues that come up in the appraisal, like dry rot, or, maybe the square footage is off. Those are the two kind of common things that we see that come up in appraisals that prevent the lender from being able to loan on that property. And so it's pretty clear in the description that those things are separate and need to be hit within those contingencies. If there is no appraisal contingency, then that means you cannot use the appraisal contingency to cancel the contract and get your deposit back. If a buyer is unable to attain the loan specified solely for this reason, then it says the seller may be entitled to the buyer's deposit or other legal remedies. And that's going to depend on whether or not they check the box or liquidated damages, right? If it's liquidated damages, then it's going to be the actual deposit paid. And if they didn't check the box, then it could be other legal remedies, specific damages. So forget about my math. Just don't look at it, look away. All right, let's get into the investigation of property contingency. So two things that are in this box. Your investigation of property contingency is your ability to do all of your inspections on the property. And we talked about just a couple minutes ago how we like to get those done early, like within the first 5 days. And then we have the time to review all of those reports and make a determination of whether or not those things are acceptable to us. We want to ask for things to be repaired, or compensation for anything that we might find during that investigation period. Sometimes though, you have buyers that want to just keep going over to the house to keep seeing it because they're excited. And once the investigation period is up, they want to get back in. And some sellers are like, you know what? I just need to be able to pack my stuff without you running through the house, coming in every day and asking for the ability to be able to get into my property. So that's kind of this informational access to the property. So it limits it to 17 days. So after 17 days, and kind of the same thought is after all of your investigations are over, then you're done. They don't have the right to keep coming back into the property. But you can change this and you can say, you know what? They want to be able to run through that property for 30 days. But just keep in mind that the seller should have the ability at some point to just say, you know what, let me pack my stuff, let me get out of here without the buyer running through the property. So that's why that's on there for 17 days. All right, investigation of property. So the agreement is contingent on the buyer's acceptance of the condition of the property and any other matter affecting the property. So that's a pretty blanket thing to say, like there's no as is addendum needed or anything like that for the contract, because the buyer has the right to investigate and make a determination of anything, whether or not they want to move forward and purchase this property. And so that's the condition. I always joke and say maybe they thought it was, navy blue, but it's actually dark blue, and they can say, you know what, I only wanted the house if it was navy blue, but it's really dark blue. Whatever it is that the buyer comes up with in good faith that says, they say, you know what, this isn't the house I thought it was. I've investigated and I've determined I no longer want to move forward. They do have the ability to cancel and get their deposit back as long as they are within the investigation period. And then we get into the buyer's investigation and matters affecting the property. So this is section 12 of the contract. So if you're ever looking like, okay, what are they entitled to investigate? How do the investigations work? That's going to be all listed under your section 12. So buyer shall have the time specified at the buyer's expense unless in writing. So unless you ask the seller to pay for the inspections, whatever inspections the buyer wants to have done, they're going to pay for them. And that sometimes kind of makes them say, wait a minute, right? Because you got the buyer inspection advisory and it's got a whole list of inspections that the buyer can do. And then once the buyer realizes these all cost money, they might say, let me figure out how to get this done. You know, some people with very limited funds will just do a pest inspection because a pest inspection will kind of give them an overall idea of what's going on with the property. And that one's cheap. That one's like about $100, right? But if you really want a full look at the property, then you're going to want to have a home inspection because they're going to go through everything on the property. And you're talking about $400, which I think is nothing when you're taking on, you know, a whole house, right? So buyers will prioritize based on their budget. When you get into things like septic and well, oftentimes they defer that cost to the seller and ask the seller to pay for those things. Do keep in mind that just because the seller is paying for the inspection does not mean that the seller is required to pay for anything that comes up on that inspection. None of that has been negotiated. So they're just uncovering the information, but there's no agreement as to how those things are going to be addressed. So buyer investigations include, but are not limited to, a general home inspection, a lead-based paint inspection, and that's going to be for anything, I think it's 1978. We're getting further and further away from seeing those. Wood destroying pest organisms, right? That's your termite inspection that you're going to want to have. They're going to want to investigate whether or not they can get insurance. And that's a real big deal for us who live in the foothills, right? Like that's a big deal. And the cost of insurance, that can definitely be a barrier to home ownership if the cost of insurance is significant. And they'll be able to review all of the reports that the seller has provided that they were contractually obligated to provide, right? So all that TDS, all the SPQ, the NHD report. So all of those reports will be part of what the buyer is reviewing and making the determination about whether or not they want to move forward with the property. So it also says without the seller's prior written consent, the buyer can make nor cause to be made any evasive or destructive holes or drilling. They can't like lift up the floors to see what's underneath. You know, oftentimes we're like, I wonder if there's hardwood under these carpets. Well, you know, don't pull up the carpet to find out, right? That's not something that you're allowed to do. You're not allowed to drill holes. They're also not allowed to bring in any governmental building or zoning inspector to check the property, right? They can go and search for permits and see what's going on and go down to the county or the city counter, but they're not going to bring somebody in, right, to check those things out. The seller must make the property available for all of the buyer investigations. They must and then the buyer has to satisfy themselves as to the condition of the property. And as I said before, either remove the contingency or cancel the agreement. However, the buyer does need to give the seller a complete copy of all the reports that were attained by the buyer. And then they say that obligation survives the termination. So even if they try to hurry up and cancel, they still have to give copies of all the reports to the seller. I get that question quite a lot. Do I have to give them the reports? The buyer paid for it. You do, because the reports are on their home and they have to get them. If you're a listing agent, you should get those reports because if someone else comes to the property, you're going to have to turn over those reports to the second buyer that's interested in purchasing the property. And it does say, except an appraisal received in connection with FHA. I'm sorry. It says this delivery of investigation reports shall not include any appraisal. So all inspections, all reports except for an appraisal, unless it's an FHA or VA loan. And the reason for that is because the FHA and VA loan appraisals live with the property for, I want to say 6 months, but I could be wrong about that, you guys. But for some significant period of time, that FHA and VA appraisal will stay with that property. But any other appraisal does not have to be turned over. The only time we typically turn over an appraisal is if we are looking to get a price reduction because the appraisal was low. Then we would want to have to prove that that appraisal came in low in order to get that price reduction, and so we would turn that over. All right, the buyer has to indemnify the seller for entry on the property. So anybody they bring in, any inspection companies that they bring in, you want to make sure that those companies are properly insured, because if they fall or something happens or they damage something, then it is the buyer's responsibility to cover any of those losses that happen when the buyer brings in those professionals to the property. So the buyer should be insured, and anybody the buyer brings in is insured, and the seller is indemnified for anything that happens during that period of time, during that investigation period. I'm going to pause a little bit just for questions. I know I'm super thorough, so there's never any questions, but just in case. All right, I'll stop being a dork. Okay, so now we're getting into the section on review of the seller's documents, which I've been talking about quite a bit. We've got the preliminary title report, we've got the HOA documents, and we've got review of leased or lien items. That's going to be our next conversation. And again, everything is at 17 days. And as I mentioned before, in order to remove any of these contingencies from here on down, you're going to need the removal with a contingency removal form. All right, so not much to say about the prelim. The one thing I will mention to you that has come across my desk is that when you're dealing with Redfin or other companies where they own, I think it's also Open Door, they don't always give you a preliminary title report. Sometimes they're giving you another type of report that isn't as detailed as a prelim. So just pay attention. When you get the prelim, you're going to want to make sure that you're reviewing it or that you're working with a title company that's going to bring it to your attention if something's going on. With that prelim, there are issues and things that you need to pay attention to in the prelim, specifically letting you know if there's like liened or lease items that are attached to that property. So prelim is a big deal. If you don't know how to read one, please get with your title officer. Leslie is amazing. She'll sit down and go over it with you and make sure you understand what to look for on that document. Condominium plan development disclosures. Again, this is another one that if you don't get them within 5 days, after 5 days of receipt, you do have the ability to cancel. So sometimes these come in late and perhaps they've already removed contingencies. But even if the contingencies have been removed and you receive those documents, you still have an additional 5 days to cancel. So it does extend your cancellation right if you have not received your HOA documents within the inspection time frame. The leased or lien items, that usually is the solar stuff that comes and bites us that we need to know about. Whenever you go to a property and you see that there's solar on the property, you immediately want to find out whether it's owned or leased. And when I say find out, I mean you want to see written documentation about that, because we keep finding that owners sometimes are confused as to whether or not they own it or lease it. And so that's one of the first things that you want to take the time to investigate whenever you see solar on a property. And then removal or waiver of contingencies with offer. So buyers shall have no obligation to remove contingencies unless the seller has provided all required documents, reports, disclosures, and information pertaining to that contingencies. A lot of times we see people removing their contingencies with the offer. That should only ever happen if they've also received all of the reports and disclosures and have reviewed them all and have made a determination that they're comfortable with everything there is to know about that property. So just never encourage your client to remove contingencies without having that information. If the buyer does remove a contingency without first receiving all required information from the seller, the buyer is relinquishing any contractual rights that apply to that contingency. If the buyer removes or waives any contingency without an adequate understanding of the property's condition or buyer's ability to purchase, buyer is acting against the advice of the agent. So make sure that's always true, that you're telling your clients, do this, fortunately or unfortunately, the market is not crazy anymore, and so we shouldn't have to deal with that. But, all of us who've been in business for a while know that things change quickly. So just keep in mind, we want them to have all the information and make an educated decision always. Removal of contingencies or cancellation. For any contingency specified, the buyer shall, within the applicable time period, remove the contingency or cancel the agreement. I keep bringing that to your attention because time is of the essence, and it's really important that they make a decision, that they take the time available to do the investigation, negotiation, and then remove the contingency or cancel the agreement at the time specified. So at that 17-day time frame, that's when they should be removing or canceling. That should not be when they're hitting you with the request for repairs. That should come during the negotiation time. Let's see, anything else I want to touch on here? And then this last piece, which we do have time to jump into, is sale of the buyer's property. So that one, I think we're going to see more and more contingent sales. So the buyer is writing an offer to purchase, but in order to purchase, they first need to sell their existing home. So whenever that is the case, you're going to make sure to check that box. And whenever you check that box, you're going to have the COP property is going to pop into the transaction, and you're going to want to complete it. Now, the COP is one of our more complicated forms. It's definitely not an easy one. I don't think that I go into detail on that one here. I don't. But there's a few moving parts on the contingency for sale of the buyer's property, and I'm happy to go into it. In fact, if you guys give me a beat, I think it's worth it. I don't have that in this particular slide, but I would like to get into that document in more detail. While I'm pulling that up, I'm happy to answer questions. If anybody has questions or comments. Are you guys awake? That's okay. I'm happy to be lullaby. Be like
Hi,
Maya.
Talisa.
Hi.
Hi, there you are. I was hoping I can turn my camera and my mic on. You touched a little bit on the solar.
Yes.
And I just found out something very interesting in the purchase of my own home, and I probably should have known this, but I found with new construction, they're only covering 40% of the solar, so that's not going to present a full solar experience.
When you say they're only covering 40%, you mean that's how much of the energy that they're covering is 40%?
The state either, because I just moved to Placer County in Loomis, and the new constructions are putting solar panels on, and they advertise as a solar owned home, which attracted us to buy this home. But then we were connected with another person who came out to say, hey, it's either the state or the counties that on new builds, they only are required to put panels on that will cover 40% of the energy. So
Gotcha, yeah.
does that make sense what I'm saying? Maybe I'm not saying
Yeah.
it correctly. Have you
Yeah,
heard
most
much
people-
about that?
Most people, when they get solar, they want to be able to have the majority of their energy come from the solar panels. And so you're saying the new home builders are doing the absolute bare minimum by
That's it, bare
only,
minimum.
yeah, by only putting 40% of the panels necessary for, you know, that homeowner's energy usage. So it's definitely something to look into. I would imagine that for some additional cost, that builder would probably add enough panels for your full, you know, energy usage. But yeah, I think they're just trying to do the bare minimum.
That's exactly
there.
what's happening. And I just
Yeah.
wanted to bring it up because we're talking about pretty much everything that I just went through. I wish I would have known during our investigation period to know more about the solar. And when it said solar owned, we were under that impression. Again, it's my fault for not investigating further what that actually meant. But I just wanted to bring it up in case somebody listens to this at a later time, this recorded meeting session.
It's a good
Yeah.
thing to look out for, definitely, and to advise our clients to pay attention
It
to.
really is. Thank you
Thank
for
you.
that.
Okay. All right, let's get into this contingency for sale of the buyer's property. The form is fine, but it does have a lot of moving parts. So there's several things to take into consideration with this form, like whether or not the property is on the market, how long the buyer has before they have to remove the contingency, whether or not the seller can take backup offers, whether or not the buyer is moving forward with the contractual obligations now or only after they get an offer on their property. So the first part of the addendum looks pretty much like any other addendum. And the first thing you're going to want to tell the potential seller is whether or not this is a contingency for just getting into contract or it's a contingency for closing before you get into contract. And then based on what you check here will be how you move forward or proceed in all of these other ones. So a buyer is entering into a contract for sale and closing. So most of the time, it's contingent on them getting into escrow and then also closing on that escrow. But hey, what we really hope is that they're already in escrow and all they need to do is close. So that's when you would check the box down here for C. And then if somehow they're able to buy the property just by getting into contract, but they don't need to actually close on it, then that would be the box B. If they're already in escrow, then you'll fill in the information about the escrow company and the escrow number. And then you're going to want to also send over the evidence of escrow, right? So that's going to be your purchase agreement and anything else that's going to show that seller, hey, I am already in escrow on this property. I only need to close escrow. And it gives you 2 days to get that information over to the seller. The buyer is entering into contract for sale of their property. If they are not in escrow, then this defaults to giving them 17 days to get that property in escrow. So, you know, worst case scenario, they want to buy your house and they're going to go run home and put their property on the market and they're going to try to sell their house and, oh, we're going to be so, we're going to price our house competitively to get our house sold so that we can get an offer right away and get into escrow. You know, for me, if I'm a seller, I'm like, ooh, why don't you go get your house on the market first before I tie up my property with your home that isn't even on the market yet, when I've already taken the time to stage my home, get photographs done and all of that. Now I'm going to wait for you to do all of those things on your property. And it's just going to extend my ability to be able to close. However, when we get down to number 7, you could the seller could make it so that they're able to take backup offers and kick that buyer out of contract, you know, as soon as they get another backup offer that's not contingent. So I do think if I'm a seller, and this is just my opinion, and I do take an offer on a property that's not even in escrow yet, that's not even on the market yet, I'm going to want to balance that out by saying I have the right to take backup offers and kick you out as soon as I get something better. Doesn't have to be the way it goes, but it's a possibility. Maybe they haven't even listed the house yet. So here is where they would talk about the listing and put the information in about the listing and whether or not the property's listed. Agent, if you're taking a contingent offer, you're going to want to investigate that house that needs to be sold. You're going to want to make sure it's priced competitively. You're going to want to make sure it's staged or presented properly, because basically you're staking your seller's house not only on this escrow going smoothly, but the other escrow going smoothly as well. So it is your duty as an agent to look into that transaction, that property, and make sure again that it's priced right and presented well so that it will sell and that that it's in a condition to sell. All right. So close of escrow of buyer's property. If A and C applies, buyer has until the following time to close escrow on the sale of the buyer's property. The scheduled close of escrow of the seller's property. So either you got to close on yours by the time we're closing on the one that we're talking about, right? So at least prior to closing this one, or if checked, excuse me, I want you to close 5 days before mine is scheduled to close, because I don't want any kind of concurrent situation that could push mine out of escrow. Or you could say, once the buyer's property closes, buyer can no longer use the contingency. So buyer saying, hey, I can't buy your house until I sell my house. And then they actually sell their house and escrow closes. Well, clearly they don't have this contingency anymore. Status of the buyer's property. The buyer agrees to keep the seller informed about the status of the transaction. Any changes, modifications, addenda, amendments, all of those things. They have 2 days to get all of that stuff over to the seller to keep them informed about what's going on. Cancellation of the buyer's property. If for some reason the buyer's property falls out of escrow after they already had it in escrow, then both the buyer and seller have the ability to cancel at that point and say, you know what, this just isn't working out. Never mind. We're going to cancel this, and we don't want to have this contingent sale happening. This is kind of the trickiest part that a lot of people just get really confuddled about or confused, is this backup offer and the seller's right to require buyers to remove contingencies. We call this the kick-out clause, and I think that's the best way to describe it. So what this is whenever you have a home, you can always market it for backup offers. You can always have it on the market and say, taking other backup offers. If while the process of taking backup offers, you get an offer that you like and that you want to take, then that's when this section comes into play as to what you can do with that situation. So if I get another offer and I'm tied up with you, if I checked box number 1, I have the immediate right to notify the buyer that all of these conditions, or I have a delayed right to notify the buyer. So I have to wait 17 days or whatever number you put here before I can invoke my kick-out clause. Or I have no right to ever kick you out. I just have to hang out and wait for you to be able to sell your house until the time frames expire. So what can you do with the kick out? So I already said you can take a backup offer, but then once you get a backup offer and you like it and you want to move forward, you have to give that buyer 3 days to do several things. So once they get your notice, they have to be able to remove this contingency for sale of their property. They have to remove their loan contingency, and they have to show proof that they have the ability to buy this home without selling their home. And then there's no loan contingency in place. So basically, you're putting them in a position where either they go get some money from somewhere else, or you're giving them their walking papers, you're kicking them out, right? So that's why we call it the kick out clause. I hope that makes sense. So they have to show proof that they can move forward. Seller shall have the right to give written notice to the buyer in writing to remove this contingency, remove the loan contingency, if any, and provide verification of sufficient funds to close escrow without the sale of the buyer's property. Okay, so that's all that they have to do. And if they can do that, great. They get to stay in escrow with you and move forward. If they can't do that, then the seller has the ability to move on and take the other offer. So that's why this section is extremely important. And when you're thinking about writing this up, if you're the buyer, you want to have a little bit of a balance, right? So if you come down here and you check no right to notify the buyer, and I'm a seller, I'm thinking like, I'm not trying to get into a locked in exclusive commitment to you to be able to sell your house. I don't know how you're going to negotiate. I don't know how you're going to keep your house clean and presentable. And I have no right to notify you or kick you out. I wouldn't like that at all. And I wouldn't see this as very competitive. This is kind of like the Goldilocks here, right? The delayed right. So give me some time. Let me have a little bit of time to get my offer accepted, to work through some things with my home. And then if I'm not able to get my act together after 17 days or whatever number, then you can kick me out. And then this one is like, hey, anytime somebody else better comes along that I like better than you, I have the right to kick you out. So definitely some choices there and some balance. And as I said before, I think you balance that with your position, right? As to whether or not your house is on the market, whether or not your house is listed, whether or not you're already in escrow. The more attractive you are in terms of your status, I think the more demanding you can be in terms of the ability the seller has to kick you out. And then we get into the seller's right to cancel. So when can the seller kick you out? So the seller can kick you out if the buyer fails to take any of the actions in 7B. That's the kick-out clause, right? The seller can kick you out if the buyer enters into contract and then the contract cancels. The seller can cancel after they give you a notice to perform if you don't get an escrow. So up here, you have 17 days to get your property in escrow, and it's the 17th day you haven't gotten your property in escrow. I'm going to give you a notice to perform, and then that way I can cancel and move on with someone else. The seller can cancel if you never gave them the escrow evidence, right? So you said, yeah, I'm in escrow, but you never gave them the evidence to prove that you were in escrow. Or the seller can cancel if the buyer fails to deliver the listing information. So you were supposed to tell me everything there is about your listing and when it was going in the MLS and all of that information, and I never got that. So, I'm done with you. The seller can cancel if the buyer fails to deliver evidence of removal of contingencies for the sale of their property. So let's say we said you need to remove contingencies by this certain time frame and you never did. I can go ahead and cancel. And the last one, the buyer gives notice to the seller, either party's cancellation of contract in the buyer's property. Wait a minute. All right. And then the buyer can cancel if they just go, you know what? This is seeming to be more difficult than I ever thought it would be. They can cancel, or if, again, their property falls out of escrow. So those are all the different ways that the buyer can cancel and get out of this contingency for sale of the buyer's property. The last piece to this complicated document is when the time frames and deposit will start. So do they start now? Am I going to start working on making the moves to purchase your home now? Or am I going to wait until I have an offer on my home and I'm in escrow on my home before I start ordering inspections and spending money? Am I going to send my deposit in now, or am I going to wait until I have have my home in escrow? And this really speaks to the motivation of the buyer. If they are willing to move forward and start spending money, they're going to be more motivated to price their home properly, to present it properly, to do everything it is to move forward on this purchase. If they're saying, oh, I'm gonna wait until I get an offer on my home before I do any of that, then that's gonna be really telling to the seller, like, they really want to hold me up and they don't want to make any moves until they get an offer on their house. So again, a lot of things to take into consideration. How motivated are they in terms of when are they willing to move forward and take action and spend their money? Are they allowing me to kick them out? Are they asking for an extended commitment? And then what is the status of their actual property? Is it in escrow? Is it even on the market? Is it even listed? Right? So those are kind of the three different things that you want to speak to in the contingency for sale of the buyer's property. All right, that is quite a lot. So I will stop there for questions. Oh, Jan, you got your hand up? Sorry, I missed it. I was
No
focused on the-
problem. You were on a roll. A quick question about 3C on the COP. As a listing agent, as a listing agent, can we actually ask for the listing agreement between the buyer and their agent? Am I reading that right?
It says buyer shall deliver to seller evidence of both the listing agreement and, if applicable, MLS listing within 1 day after. So yes.
Okay, thank you.
And I know we would normally not see that, but I think if you're asking the seller to take their property off the market, you'd want to see some hard facts like, what are the terms that they're agreeing to list the property? So yeah, you can.
Thank you.
Okay. Well, that is enough for today. I need a nap now. We'll get into more of this. Oh, actually, next Thursday, hopefully you will be with family, having turkey or whatever you have. And I definitely will be. So no class next Thursday, but we'll get together again the next Thursday after that and get into the next section of the RPA. We're almost done. I think we moved to page 3 of the grid. So excited. All right, you guys. If I don't talk to you, I will see you after the holidays. Have a wonderful holiday. Thank you.
Thank you, Talisa.
Thanks, Lisa.
Thank you.